between my my minimalist program that we began with and Doug's maximalist program for getting rid of pensions as a whole, just getting a universal pension plan, and Sam's I guess transitional strategy or transitional program, we have a lot to kind of discuss and debate. So we'll have a few rounds of discussion.
Versus the old. This is a very serious problem. I don't know what it's like here, but I think an awful lot of young people in the United States believe they will never get a Social Security check, that it's going to disappear by the time they retire. And actually a lot of people in their 20s are happy to have a job at all. So they just like just getting a paycheck at all. It's a very, very serious problem with solidarity across generations. There's been a 30-year propaganda campaign in the U.S. On the inevitable bankruptcy of Social Security, which, you know, even if you believe the official projections, it's not the bankruptcy of Social Security. It means that there might be, maybe, if you accept all their assumptions, demographic and economic, a shortfall of 1% of GDP. That is something that can be easily financed. It's not, you know, we spend, I think, 2% of GDP on advertising in the United States, so it's really not. It's not an overwhelming problem, in other words. But the propaganda campaign has been so successful, it's destroyed any faith in the public system among younger folks. Older people, however, feel, and the politicians have been very careful about this, of insulating people who are near retirement age from any threats to long-term cuts in the system. So they've created a very successful generational divide along those lines. And another thing that I find very, very disturbing. I just read this book by a sociologist, Jennifer Silva. I can't remember the title of the book, but she interviewed a bunch of, about 100 younger working class adults, people in their 20s and early 30s. And their consciousness that is revealed in these interviews is a very depressing thing. They have been so, they've known nothing but neoliberalism. They've known nothing but a world of self-reliance. They have no faith in the state or any kind of public institutions. They believe in the market because the market is impersonal. They believe that you're in this world all on your own, a world of self-reliance. Everybody's lying to you. All you can do is just trust yourself and trust no state, no school, no institution, no union, nothing. And that is how apparently a vast portion of the younger working class in the United States thinks. So. I don't know how you create a cultural solidarity out of that kind of atomized view of the world. And then where you have opposing material interests of people who think they're never going to get a Social Security check anyway because the government is lying to them. You can't trust in anything. You know, I think we have to do something to change the discourse and create and revive notions of solidarity, and working through financial markets is exactly the wrong way to go to reignite any notion of social solidarity. I don't know if Canadians are as atomized in their view of the world as Americans are. I think we are certainly the world leaders in promoting self-reliance and the atomized individual, but I think a lot of the rest of the world is catching up to us on that. But it's very, very hard to do. I don't know how you do that generational solidarity. The existing public pension system is a material instance of promoting that solidarity. You know, it's today's workers supporting today's retirees. Presumably a deal across the generations. This sort of arrangement will continue into the future, but it's hard to maintain given this propaganda campaign, given this kind of consciousness that's developed among younger people. So, if somebody can figure that one out, I would be very deeply grateful. On the issue of free cash flow is basically the difference between what a corporation makes in profits and what it spends on capital expenditures and things like that. It is right now, it's enormously wide. Corporate America is extraordinarily profitable. They have financial assets that are now equal to 100% of US GDP on their balance sheets. It's about the same size as tangible assets. They have more money than they know what to do with. So the notion that corporate, I presume it's a little different in Canada. I think it's even a little different in Europe. I mean, despite the European crisis, certainly, German corporations are not short of money. So the notion that corporations need to be pampered and that they need a lot of help from outside money like pension funds in order to finance their operations. It's completely wrong. They're just sitting on enormous piles of cash that they just don't want to spend. The shareholders want it. They don't want to spend it on machinery or on hiring workers or anything like that. The shareholders want the money, either that or the corporations are retaining it on their balance sheets. There was a period a while back where Apple actually had more money in the bank than the U.S. Treasury. So, you know, that is, Apple's been under pressure from the shareholders to distribute that cash pile. They've distributed some of it. But that just gives you an idea of how much money corporate America is sitting on and not doing anything with. So you need to shake that stuff loose. They don't need any pampering. They don't need any injections of funds. They need to have these the surplus money and the money that's going to their shareholders that needs to be redirected towards employing people and rebuilding the infrastructure and making some kind of sustainable economy over the long term. Oh, the unfunded liabilities question. I'm not sure exactly what you mean, but I noticed there is a tendency to deny that this is a real problem. It is a real problem. And somebody's going to have to pay for it. And there's a big struggle over who's going to pay for it, obviously. Right now, it looks like the working class is going to pay for it. And I don't see enough of a fight back to change that situation. You know, the U.S., the bankruptcy of the city of Detroit, a whole bunch of other public entities are going to look to that out and just not pay the retirees. Now, these retirees are people who are living close to the poverty line, and now they're going to be below it. And it's a real problem. It's just a combination of incredible tax cuts for the very rich and a generation of underfunding of pension funds has left us in a very, very serious situation. Expropriate the fat boys. The novel, Robert Penn Warren's novel, All the King's Men. There's a scene in there where the Huey Long character is, early in his career, giving really boring speeches about tax policy. And his advisor, who's the narrator, pulls him aside and says, "Forget all that stuff, just tell them you're going to soak the fat boys." And I think that's a good slogan, soak the fat boys.
You want to pick up on that, Sam?
I did want to ask Doug, in terms of the shareholders getting all this money, I want to know whether whether we know what they do with it. In other words, have they just learned to spend an awful lot, which I think is part of the story, or do they reinvest it in some way, including abroad? What happens to it, if we know anything in detail about that? So on this question of young, old...
Do you want him to answer that now?
Oh, I'll just say very quickly, they buy more securities with it, and they buy houses in the Hamptons, and their second Maseratis with it.
Okay, the question of the young and old. I mean, you see the danger in an auto plant if somebody ends up with a two-tier system and the next round of bargaining, the attack is on people's pensions. You know that they're not going to be there to support it. So the question is, how do you build that support? And you're not going to build it by asking young people to support pensions that they don't think they will get. I think one of the points about arguing for a universal plan, and it wouldn't just be a policy, you'd actually have to be mobilizing, there'd be a real struggle for it, is to be making the case constantly that you're trying to deal with the insecurity of everybody, including young people, that you're trying to deal with the insecurity of a Walmart worker by actually fighting for. I mean, I think they're only going to believe you. They're not going to believe you if you say we stand for decent pensions for everybody. That's kind of a yawn. They're going to have to see that unions, teachers, are actually leading some kind of a struggle for addressing the insecurity of people who are in low-paying jobs. And you know, the first problem is getting teachers to do this kind of a thing. One of the things we talked about is trying to do educationals with young teachers to mobilize them around this question and get them to see the importance of playing a leadership role on this. In terms of the question of co-optation, again, it's a more general problem. I mean, the whole point of unions was that you're living within capitalism, and you're trying to figure out how do we have some independence from the system so we can express a different set of values and have the resources to do it. And for a while, from the 30s into the 70s, unions could perform that, and they can't do that anymore just as unions. I think that's the big lesson of the last 30 years, that if you're just trying to be a militant union on your own to represent your members, you can't do that. You're not strong enough to do that. So you have to start extending that to having some kind of a class perspective. If workers are going to have any kind of independence within capitalism and struggling with capitalism, they're going to have new kinds of organizations that have a class perspective, which will be partly bringing that into unions, partly having other organizations. And again, it brings up the question of the left again. The question that was raised about the left not actually wanting to look at the numbers, I think that's a good point. I mean, I think there is that kind of a populist tendency where we want to avoid how difficult certain questions are by wishing them away, and we can't do that. We're going to have to take a look at all these hard questions and answer them. The other thing, I just want to flag the pay-as-you-go question again. With most pension plans, you want a fund because you're worried about whether the fund will go broke. With the universal plan, you don't have to worry about that anymore, but you do have to worry about it being relatively smooth. You have demographic changes. But that can kind of be fixed. I think the only reason to think about a fund with the universal plan is if you actually are trying to build a fund, if you really are trying to absorb savings so that you can use them, not just for pensions, but as part of some kind of a larger agenda of intervening in the economy. And then a fund is actually a way of you having the fund and challenging the financial sector, again, in that part of the market, the retail part of the market. The question of retirement, I think there's another dimension to this. I think retirees are potentially a political force. They live long and they've got time, and if they have some income, this has been a real barrier in terms of, Leo and I spoke in Portland to a terrific group of, at the Musicians Hall, to a terrific group that was organizing around low-paid immigrant workers. I think 90% of them were refugees from the 60s. Kind of a smattering of a couple of young people, but that's who has some time and has some income and space to actually think about this. But that question that you're raising directly links up to political questions. Steve's question on the point about defined benefit plans as they emerged, as I understand them, was really our battle. We wanted plans. We wanted to say, we're not investors. You guys are the investors. We don't care how you do this. We want this plan. That's what we want to do with risk. And the point about defined contribution plans is the company's beginning to say, we don't want to take these risks. Now, I know what'll happen. If defined contribution plans start doing terrific, they'll start putting less into it. Unless you've got the struggle to, the strength to do it. I've got a couple of other comments that I can't read. So let me just get to Leo's point. I think this is fundamental. If we're going to talk about socialists and what our vision is, we have to deal with this issue of how people treat their own labor and the inequalities. How I see this in practical terms is fighting for a better universal plan and fighting for some control over finance is still a fairly modest stage in actually transforming society. And if we had a situation where we had a decent floor, I think the average CPP is what, $6,000 a year right now? $6,500. If we start talking about actually so that somebody, who had a lousy income for most of their lives is actually going to, the last years of their remaining life isn't also going to be shitty, that they actually have a decent income, and even if it's graded to some extent, with a cap on it so that there is, the kind of equality that most of us can't imagine because maybe the ratio was 2 to 1 instead of 12 to 1. I think, that practically speaking, I can't imagine doing better than that. Once you're struggling for something like that, that can be your ideal, you've done something really significant. If you're giving decent pensions to people who've been outside the labor market and narrowing how related it is to income, because that is a problem, that you don't want to just reproduce the previous incomes. But I also think we'll have, if we really were about to win some of these things, there'll also be compromises with finance. It's very hard for me to imagine that we have the power to suddenly exclude finance completely from this. It may be a goal. So I guess I see it in some kind of dynamic term, that if you're actually struggling for some of these things, you're beginning to introduce the importance of class solidarity, both as an ethical thing, but as a material thing that you need in terms of building the class, and it's just an ongoing struggle. Part of Leibowicz's point is he looks at Cuba, and he still sees the same problem in Cuba. That it's after the revolution, and there still is the sense of I'm a skilled worker, and I know more. So it's, I completely agree with Leo that we should be honest about raising it. I can't imagine winning it in terms of achieving that kind of equality within capitalism, except through an incredibly long period of time. But I could imagine that the kind of universal pension that we demand would be quite a radically egalitarian pension. Oh yeah, I guess once you start taking a look at the numbers, Kevin, and you're asking, well, how do we pay for this? And you start thinking about, you're going to take a lot of the pension plans that exist and fold them in. You're going to take, some social programs may be less necessary. You're going to fold them in. You're going to get rid of RRSPs and stuff. At the end of the day, we're still talking about a much larger benefit for everybody, and it still is going to require the question, not just restructuring taxes, but taxing.
Doug?
I was just thinking, whenever the topic of pension reform comes up, I'm thinking the Italian approach to these sorts of things. About 10 years ago, a labor minister who was involved in a scheme to cut pensions was assassinated. The scheme to cut pensions was set aside for many years to follow. Then a few years later, yet another, an economist, I believe, who was advising the labor ministry on pension reform was also assassinated. And they shelved those schemes for a while. The Guardian had an article last year about Berlusconi's labor minister who was going around with a police escort of a dozen people regularly. So the Italians have one approach to this question. Perhaps the rest of us are not so bold to embrace. The student debt issue. I mean, I think a lot of my friends in what's left of the Occupy movement are obsessed with debt. And I understand why. It is very, very visible and concerned. It's a very big burden for a lot of people. The student debt thing is just passing $1 trillion in the U.S. A lot of it is a result of for-profit universities, which are really terrible, terrible places. But the financial markets have increasingly become a substitute for social policy. So student debt is has been rising because public universities in the United States have gotten more and more expensive. The University of California now is something like $30,000. It used to be free. And the debt becomes a very visible symptom of the fact that we have the welfare state has largely disappeared. We have people use their Visa cards for income maintenance if they're unemployed. Medical debt is responsible for like half the personal bankruptcies in the United States. The financial markets have become this realm for the private provision of what should be publicly provided, collectively provided services. So I think if you could, and unfortunately, good friends in the Occupy movement are so obsessed with the debt, they don't really take the next step and talk about, it's because so many of them are so instinctively anti-statist, they don't want to talk about a public sector providing health care, providing free education from K to PhD, But I think you could build, in theory, some sort of analysis, if not movement, that looks at debt as the symptom of this kind of shifting from public provision to private provision. And the whole defined benefit to defined contribution is a shifting of risk from the employer to the worker. And it's very unlikely that anybody's going to acquire any kind of fortune based on a defined contribution scheme. You look at the numbers on the size of the average 401k in the United States, it's enough to finance a few cases of dog food. It's really not. It's not something you're going to get rich on. The attack on retirement is there's a lot of that going on. I think Mitt Romney got famous for his remarks about the 47% of the population are takers, they're moochers. He's very popular in the American right.
Like him.
Well, no, he's a productive member of society. He's an investor.
He's a productive moocher.
The ineffable Phil Gramm, the former senator from Texas, once described rich people as the ones who are pulling the wagon while the working class is riding in the wagon. That's the kind of consciousness. So, retiree is like, not even riding in the wagon, but just extra cargo who's like dead weight on the wagon. Unfortunately, this kind of discourse has gotten very, very popular. On the question of building up funds, the whole idea of funding anything kind of rubs me the wrong way. I think Keynes, here I go quoting Keynes again, I'm sorry, but he just said somewhere said that investment or savings are two names for the same thing, which is the difference between income and consumption. And I think the fund thing gets very mystified. What we want to do is shift real resources. We want to shift real resources away from the second Maserati and the big house in the Hamptons towards clean energy and high-speed rail and good health care and free education. And building up funds is not going to do that. I mean, we want to do is, take from the rich and give to the poor, in the crudest terms. And building up funds just becomes a temptation for portfolio managers to come in and manage them at a high fee. Because I'm very dubious about that sort of thing. And then finally, Kevin mentioned the cultural question, and this is also something that Leo was talking about. I mentioned in my talk, this is my interest now, but I think Foucault coined this term, the neoliberal self. Foucault gave a great series of lectures, this book, The Emergence of Biopolitics, it's called. It's kind of funny in some ways, because here's this French guy discovering Anglo-Saxon economics for the first time, the self-reliant individual. It's like, boy, isn't that curious? It's not so state-centered. What about self-reliance? But he does talk about, and he talks quite a bit about Gary Becker's concept of human capital, and the trend, and and I think this has really permeated popular consciousness now. We're all little entrepreneurs responsible for ourselves, and we invest. You go to school, you're investing in your human capital, and you expect a return on that capital. So we're all little capitalists. We're not workers. Class conflict dissolves, and it creates this sense of this atomized, self-reliant individual is incapable of solidarity. And this, ideology is certainly spread verbally in the media, but it's also people's day-to-day experience. Is nobody's going to take care of you. If you fall, you're in the sidewalk. It's tough, and if you don't pull your own weight, you're finished. And I think this kind of consciousness is so dominant now that I really, like I was saying, I just don't know how to get out of it. I don't know how you create some kind of sense of solidarity out of that. Now, Richard Hofstadter says somewhere that in U.S. history, there's been only one period where the notion of the self-reliant individual has not been predominant. That was roughly from the 30s through the long 60s into the early 70s. That was created by the crisis and the Depression and the New Deal, which then led to a reconfiguration of the government, social policy, but also the thinking that there was some sense of public purpose and collectivity, which is very odd in American history. And now that anomalous period is over, and we're back to the self-reliant thing. But now it seems like with a vengeance. But I don't really know. We had the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression and didn't produce anything like a rebirth of that collective consciousness at all. You look at Obamacare, it's the perfect example of neoliberal social policy. It's all about markets and self-reliance and choice and all that stuff. It's not a universal program. There's some subsidies involved for purchase to poor people, but through private companies. So it's just, this is social policy, and this is the left rate of social policy under neoliberalism. I don't know how to change it.
I want to give a more optimistic example.
Not a high bar.
When the auto workers began to merge with unions that have a lot of part-time workers, like the hotel and restaurant sector, sectors, one of the questions was, what should they pay into the strike fund and what should they get out of the strike fund? And the decision made was that they should pay into the strike fund a lot less because they couldn't afford it. It was really based on their ability to pay. But there was a remarkable consensus at the board that they should be paid the same as everybody else. The argument made was that when we're in struggle, when we're in a strike, we're all the same. And I think that was, the optimism of that is that it was through thinking about struggles and acting in struggles that this notion of we're actually part of the same class, and if we have those common needs, that it was actually easier to make that argument. I'm not sure that those same workers who voted for that would have said that about something else. I think the struggle part of it was actually part of what led to that kind of
Come back to one of the obstacles we also face at the national level in Canada. The main seniors organization is one that's mainly, the Canadian Association of Retired Persons is mainly very oriented to very individual protection of individualized pensions. We don't have across unions pensioners organized, and we don't have a seniors organization that's organized along the militant lines. And certainly over the next term, if we're going to kind of address the widening of the pension plan along the lines that Sam was speaking about, that is going to have to change, because the political weight is very important, but it's not organized. And then its possibilities connected to younger people is extremely important. But if it's stuck at the Canadian Association of Retired Persons, it's never going to happen. We should turn over to Doug, Sam, and then Kevin to give the final word.
The audience question is interesting because I always find pensions are a difficult topic, partly because I think they reek of accountancy and actuarial calculation, but they also kind of reek of decay and death. And so I think people just don't want to think about it very much. So that is a fundamental structural problem with developing an audience for this kinds of issues. The question of what to do with the middle ground, what to do with the present. I think what one must do is to try to stay off the territory that is naturally that of the capitalists. And by pushing for public programs and the revival of the notion of the public sector as an arena of solidarity. And as I was trying to make the point, I've been trying to make the point all afternoon, that the financial markets are this realm of atomization and self-reliance and alienation by their very structural nature, economically, psychologically, everything about it. It takes us in the wrong direction. But I also think of getting people, if you get getting people in the boards of corporations or getting them involved in managing pensions, what's going to happen is almost inevitable that they're going to identify upwards. They're going to identify with the bourgeoisie. They're going to think, this is a nice bottle of wine here. This 400 thread count sheet is really comfy. And you can understand why people might want to do that. But, remember my Catholic childhood, you want to avoid near occasions of sin. So, and, it's also like, I had some friends who were involved with what's his name? Mentioned earlier, the FLCIO guy was working on shareholder activism issues.
Mason.
Well, my friend is Dr. Mason, but the guy he's working with.
David Silvers?
Yeah, David Silvers. I heard these tales from my friend who'd been working there. They're making all these alliances with extremely questionable characters, all these shareholder activist guys. And they're supposed to be, marriages of convenience, temporary little liaisons they're having. But these guys are just, use a technical term, scumbags. And they're really bad people. You don't want to make alliances with them. And to see the labor movement thinking that they can get some tactical gain out of making alliances with people whose jobs are mostly about attacking the working class and getting more for themselves. It's just a very, very bad set of lines. So just like trying to stay away from that realm as much as possible. A point that I wish I'd made more succinctly in my initial presentation was that there's a kind of sleight of hand involved in the use of the word investment around these issues. When people, I think a lot of people think, regular people, but also people who even work on these kinds of issues, that if you buy a share of ExxonMobil is somehow getting money out of the deal. No, you're buying it from some other previous shareholder of ExxonMobil, and ExxonMobil isn't getting a penny out of it. So like there's a very different, we need to be careful about making the distinction of what we mean by investment. On the tax haven question, I notice that this is actually, it's starting to evoke some elite concerns. The OECD has been working on tax shelters as a problem. There was some resentment in the EU about Ireland as a state tax shelter. So there does seem to be at least a little bit of a mainstream backlash against tax havens. But you know, if you look at the United States, given the structural fragmentation of the U.S. system of government, we have something like 3,000 counties, almost 60,000 governmental units in the United States or something. It's just like, so they're in constant competition with each other to offer tax breaks. So it's just impossible to imagine how to get around that. So it's an extraordinarily serious problem, and perhaps we can import the Italian approach to that as well.
Italian approach now is the pitchfork movement.
And finally, on the question of the American dream, you know, the American dream for a couple of centuries had a material basis. It was a land where people could rise. Each succeeding generation could look forward to incomes higher than the preceding generation. That has basically ceased. People in their 20s now are in terrible, terrible shape. Educational attainment in the United States, we're the only, about the only country in the world where the younger cohort of adults is not surpassing the older cohort in educational attainment. It's a society that is, I think, become stagnant and is eroding in many ways. And the material basis for belief in that dream, you know, is undermined. But as I said earlier, I think the reaction, at least so far, has been intensification of individualism and self-reliance, rather than a questioning of the whole basis of the setup itself, which is unfortunate. You know, there's that Occupy moment where it seemed like everything was changing for a couple of years, but that largely evaporated. And an awful lot of the left in the United States is, you know, this kind of anarchist, anti-statist trend in a lot of the American left. A friend of mine says that an anarchist is a neoliberal without money. I think that's harsh, but I think there's something to that. It is very often this kind of this fantasy that you can somehow secede from the larger society, build your own little world. It's another version of self-reliance. It's like a hipster version of self-reliance. I don't know. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why the Occupy movement fizzled. There was certainly a lot of police repression and such that helped a lot. But there was this very deep skepticism about the state and large-scale action. And it's very, very hard to get around that. Until there's some sort of rethinking of the way we approach even radical politics in the U.S., it's hard to see how we get to more collective vision in the future.
Sam, you got to pick up the optimistic, the optimistic turn out.
You have to be the antidepressant.
Antidepressant, yeah.
We are so long.
I think the problem is that it's not just pensions. It's, I mean, the cooptation question, the question of what happens to our labor, isn't just a question of what happens to the pension funds. It's the work we do and what it's used for. So I mean, this is an issue of capitalism. And I guess the question about, I'm skeptical about monitoring these funds because they're always doing something that's rotten in one way or the other. And I think the only way that we can deal with it is that if there are reasons beyond the fund, if there's a larger campaign going on, then I think we have a responsibility to join it. I mean, if there's a particular strike that's strategic, the question of apartheid. But those are very selective things. There's not a strategy for trying to make these funds into good things. Those are just things you have to do if there's a larger problem. And I mean, one of the problems with people seeing that, recognizing that they don't have access to the American dream, although a lot of people still have access to it, but that most people don't have to. It is what Doug said. There's just more pressure on people to try harder to take care of themselves. It hasn't led to any kind of a change, and I think that gets back to the question of the left. In the absence of structures that people have confidence in, that if I work through them and struggle through them, I can change things, they're going to resort to individual survival. It's not just a cultural, abstract thing. It's a very material thing. You're going to worry about your family, and you're going to deal with this. So I think this keeps coming back to the question of building the left. And Leo's point about the 50s and 60s, I mean, it's very important. I mean, when we're trying to understand how we got to where we are today, it was the nature, it was what the labor movement was like in the good period that has a lot to do with this, in terms of believing that capitalism would have these answers. I guess the one thing I just want to leave on is this question of, I still think that if we're actually organizing and mobilizing, and Leo's question of, do you go in and make the case for everybody should have the best pension, or are you trying to be practical and make some compromises? I guess I lean to the latter. It wasn't like I was being misinterpreted. If I'm going in to mobilize with teachers, I'm going to actually talk about how teachers can come pretty close to a transition that might mean some sacrifice, but that's going to protect a lot of these pensions. But I really welcome people criticizing me for doing that. And I think that's part of the issue. Or for, I'm very comfortable making a speech on why everybody should have the same pension. I just don't think that that would be practical in terms of mobilizing.
In terms of what?
So we'll turn the last word over
Mobilize.
You can compress without being equal.
Okay, just very quickly, I wouldn't mind picking up on what Sam said about monitoring the funds, and it sort of relates to James's question or issue about how do we do this, or what concretely can we do in the meantime. With respect, I gently disagree with the point Sam made about monitoring, in part because there is no monitoring. The monitoring that we do now is kind of like what's the rate of return, and that's it. That's kind of all that's happening. And I think at least left trade unionists might take up a role here in saying, this is actually kind of important, and we need some mechanism to sort of follow what our own institutions are doing. And I'm not saying like major research projects. And one of the, maybe I'll close with this. One simple idea that I had, which would, in theory, relieve the task of doing hard, research and figuring what's going on, is to actually establish some sort of obligation on the plan itself to disclose certain kinds of information about its investment practices, like what's a private equity investment, is it involved in public-private partnerships or privatization? Obligate the plan to report that to plan members. Plans aren't obligated to do that, and they don't. So that'd be the kind of idea where, and there you're sort of holding them to account to some extent, and when it fails, when and if it fails, well then, hopefully that can have a politicizing effect. But I don't suggest it as any sort of panacea or to create illusions. It's just it's kind of one practice that we could do right away that I think could be helpful. But I actually do think that the more important project is more related to the vision that Sam outlined of really a substantial, comprehensive alternative. That's really, I think, what could inspire and interest people to get involved.
Without drawing this on, Kevin, but if there's a campaign against P3s, then obviously we should monitor it.
Yeah.
So thank you. Kevin will be doing some workshops, I think, in Ottawa for the public there at some point in time. We'll also be doing some other follow-up on this. We'll have this out on Left Stream, which has been going around the country and the world, in fact. I've been hearing from pension activists around in many different places.
The video is being posted.
Yeah.
Where is it?
On Left Stream.
Left Stream.
Yeah. And thank you, and particularly thank you to Kevin again.
Where
Left stream,
Left stream?
yeah.